Hey guys, it's the Tominator here, and if the reactions to my last video are any indication, most of you would seem to vehemently agree that there's a major problem with the current state of judging in professional bodybuilding. However, where many people were quick to launch personal attacks and essentially crucify head judge Steve Weinberger as if he's solely to blame, I think the problem goes much deeper than that. While it's true that the purpose of that little satire was to expose the inconsistency and hypocrisy of the judge's half-assed, poorly articulated explanations, it wasn't meant to be a call to arms against Weinberger per se. It's my firm belief that replacing a single person won't fix anything, even if that person does happen to be the head judge, because the system itself would still remain woefully inadequate and susceptible to corruption. Around this same time last year, I made a lengthy video essay criticizing the numerous shortcomings of the IFBB's judging procedure, so if you're curious to see just how incredibly uninformative and pathetically oversimplified the current scoring system really is, go ahead and watch that one first. But in short, the problem with the existing judging system is that it's completely non-transparent. It's just this black box we can't see into because the judges merely assign an overall ranking to each competitor, but don't explain how or why they consider one bodybuilder to be better or worse than another. There's no transparency and therefore no accountability on the part of the judges, since they don't need to justify their decisions whatsoever. To make matters worse, we as fans have no real insight into the decision-making process either. Oh, we're told they look for X, Y, and Z, but none of these factors are explicitly quantified in any way. So at the end of the day, the curious spectator, perhaps seeking out scorecards in the aftermath of another controversial result, is left with little more than a perplexing spreadsheet of numbers that might as well have been drawn randomly from a hat in some cases. I've been mulling over this predicament for quite a while now and believe I've arrived at a solution, an alternative judging system that doesn't suck total donkey balls, at least in theory. Now you might be asking, why bother, Tom? Why even waste your time when you know it's just going to fall on deaf ears anyway? Yeah, fair point, but look guys, I'm not so full of myself or hopelessly deluded to believe the IFBB will actually listen to a lowly YouTuber like me. I realize there's like a 0% chance of them suddenly switching over and adopting a brand new, untested system. But as I said in an earlier Instagram post, if all we do is criticize and complain without offering any solutions, we're little better than a bunch of toxic trolls. So as you've probably guessed, the main goal with this new system was to make it more transparent, to really open things up and give us a better idea of what's going on in the minds of the judges. Since bodybuilding is supposed to be judged on all these different criteria, why not document it by breaking it down into sub-scores and assign separate scores for each of the poses as well? More precise feedback would not only undoubtedly be appreciated by the fans, but also by the bodybuilders themselves, who would more accurately be able to acknowledge their shortcomings and realize what they need to improve for next time. It ought to be mentioned though up front that I'm not claiming this scoring system is flawless by any means. With something as unavoidably subjective as bodybuilding, a perfect judging system is simply impossible. It is, however, irrefutably better in one crucial aspect, and that is that it's way more transparent. So while I'm not claiming the end results would necessarily be any different, at least we'd have a better understanding as to how the placings were determined. So without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so for starters, in this new system I'm proposing, there would be two separate scores for each competitor. The first is what I'm calling the individual score, where they're evaluated on the basic bodybuilding criteria such as mass, conditioning, symmetry, etc. You know, all the fundamental factors the judges are ostensibly looking for in the first place. Anyway, this would be done in the preliminary round of prejudging when they come out on their own and go through the compulsories. It would also be considered during their individual posing routines. The second score is what I'm calling the comparative score, and this would be calculated during the mandatory comparison round when they get called out in a lineup and go pose for pose. Both of these subscores would ultimately be converted to a value out of 50, where a 50 represents the highest possible number you could get. They'd then be added together to arrive at the final score, which would obviously be out of 100. So in this system, unlike the current ordinal system, the higher the score, the better. Okay, but that's just a very broad overview. Let's go over it now in a little more detail. In terms of the individual score, there are 4 distinct criteria the judges would be evaluating: conditioning, muscularity, symmetry and proportions, and posing and presentation. Each of these criteria would be assigned a separate subscore ranging from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest and 1 being the lowest, increasing in increments of 0.5. Now, before I explain the individual score any further, let's briefly clarify what each of these 4 categories encompasses, just so there's no confusion. Conditioning is essentially the leanness, hardness, and dryness of the muscle. It consists of things like muscular definition, detail, striations, and cross-striations, also known as feathering. We would also include separation, both within the same muscle group and between adjacent muscle groups, vascularity, and so-called graininess. This score is then multiplied by 4 for a maximum possible value of 20, and I'll explain the reasoning behind the multiplier in a moment. Next up, we have muscularity. This simply has to do with the size of the muscles themselves. It's not necessarily about how big the bodybuilder is or how much they weigh, as taller individuals with larger frames would always have an advantage in that case, but more about how much muscle a person is packing relative to their frame. So things like thickness, density, roundness or fullness, and muscle volume all come into play. Next, we have symmetry and proportions. I've chosen to combine these two aspects as they tend to go hand in hand, and symmetry is often used in bodybuilding circles as a misnomer for proportionate, balanced, or aesthetic anyway. What we're really talking about here is completeness from head to toe, balanced, proportionate development of all the muscle groups of the body, plus how well the physique is said to flow, and of course, bilateral symmetry, or making sure the left and right sides match. Finally, we come to posing and presentation. This includes not only posing execution and a well-crafted routine, but also general stage presence and confidence, grace and poise, and energy and charisma. These latter 3 categories all receive a score multiplier of 2, meaning their respective maximum subscores are each 10. Therefore, in total, the highest possible individual score is 50. Okay, so you may be wondering, what's up with the multipliers and why does conditioning receive a higher one? The reason conditioning receives a 4 times multiplier, or double that of the other 3 criteria, is because conditioning is objectively the most important criteria in modern day bodybuilding. That's how it works now. You can be an absolute monster out there, but if you're waterlogged and look like you should be guest posing, you're simply not going to place well. Meanwhile, smaller, less genetically gifted bodybuilders who bring the cuts typically come out ahead of otherwise superior physiques. The emphasis on conditioning is to prevent the Cedric McMillans of the world from sweeping every show they enter on the basis of great genetics alone. Because let's face it, without crisp, polished conditioning to top it all off, a bodybuilder resembles more of a work in progress as opposed to a real finished product. I originally had it so that conditioning was times by 4, then mass by 3, symmetry and proportions by 2, and finally posing and presentation by only 1. But the problem there was that did not sufficiently punish competitors who can't keep it together. Think of the Paul Dillettes who can't hold the pose, or the 2018 Phil Heaths who look out of breath and unable to control their midsections. So that's why I ultimately just went with 4, 2, 2, and 2. Okay, now that all might sound like a lot to take in, but it's really not that complicated. The judges literally just have to assign each competitor 4 numbers between 1 and 5, and that's it. The calculations could be done after the fact. But keep in mind that's only half the equation. The comparative score comprises the other 50 marks, and this is determined by how well the bodybuilder fares going pose for pose in the mandatory callouts. Just as with the current system, contestants would be evaluated using an ordinal ranking system, with a 1 designating first place, 2 for second, 3 for third, and so on. However, what's different here is that all 8 of the mandatory poses are now scored individually, so we'd finally be able to see who the judges had winning each pose. At the conclusion of this round, the 8 subscores would be tallied up, and whoever had the lowest total would receive 50 points. The person with the second lowest total would receive a 45, the third lowest receives a 40, and so on down the line. The reason for converting both the individual and comparative scores to a number out of 50 is because when we add them together to arrive at the final score, you can see that the maximum possible score is 100. Thus, you can think of the final score as like a percentage, even though technically it's not. Truth be told, it didn't have to be 100. That was admittedly pretty arbitrary. I just thought it would be more elegant this way. Now, obviously, earning a 100 would be nearly impossible in reality because it would signify that the bodybuilder in question is essentially flawless. And even Phil Heath or Ronnie Coleman in their respective primes were not flawless. But this isn't a problem, as we shouldn't expect any bodybuilder to receive a 100 since nobody is perfect after all. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Now, let's just clarify a few more things before we wrap this up. I decided to format this in a little Q&A just to try and keep it concise. Question: does each judge assign their own set of scores? Answer: yes. Just like with the current system, the scores of all the judges are recorded individually and then summed together. The difference is that they are then averaged to keep the final number below 100. Also, the highs and lows are still discarded to help prevent individual biases from creeping in, and this is one of the few actually smart and useful features of the existing system, so it makes sense to keep it. Question: what happens if 2 or more bodybuilders tie in their individual scores? Answer: the bodybuilder with the better comparative score wins. Question: what happens if 2 or more bodybuilders tie in their comparative scores then? Answer: the reverse of the above, the bodybuilder with the better individual score wins. In the event they are tied in both scores, then the bodybuilder with the higher conditioning subscore wins. If even the conditioning is tied, then it goes down through the criteria, i.e. muscularity, then S&P, and then PMP. Question: are the bodybuilders ranked from first to last across all 8 mandatories throughout the entire lineup? Answer: no, they are only ranked within their own callout. This is not ideal, but rather a time-saving compromise, as it would be cumbersome, impractical, and overwhelming to rank from 1 to 20, or however many competitors there are, all at once. So, for example, if the top callout consists of 3 competitors, the lowest they can rank on any one pose is a 3. And note that callout sizes must be between 3 and 6 competitors now. This minimum of 3 is designed to help prevent Dorian Yates' 1997 situations from arising, where he should have been dead last in the front double biceps, but would have scored no lower than a 2 because it was just him and Nasser up there. Question: for the comparative score, if you decrement each score by 5, starting with 50, that only accounts for up to 10 contestants, or 11 if you assign the 11th place bodybuilder a 0. What about the remaining competitors? Answer: this is a genuine problem with the system I didn't discover until after the fact and would probably need to be tweaked. I considered decreasing by 2.5 instead of 5 so that 20 competitors could be ranked, but then the difference between scores just didn't seem to be enough. I also considered converting the values into a percentage, where a 1 would equate to 100%, a 2 would be 95%, assuming a lineup of 20 contestants. This would be much more accurate, obviously, but also a lot more complicated and messy. I wanted to avoid decimal points and keep it as simple as possible, but it's definitely a flaw in the proposed system that would somehow need to be addressed. Question: what happens in the event the bodybuilder is moved between different callouts? For example, he's initially brought out in the first callout, but then moved down to the second. Answer: and I already answered this on my IG, so I'll just show that here. Question: does the head judge still determine the callouts? Answer: no, not initially at least. Competitors are brought out according to their previously calculated individual scores. However, as already noted, the head judge may elect to move certain contestants up or down among callout groups. On a related note, another change is that the points leader is no longer automatically placed in the center, as this telegraphs the frontrunner to the remaining judges and could skew their perceptions. Question: is the individual score set in stone before the comparison round? Answer: no, the judges may choose to reevaluate and edit their subscores when they see the competitors standing side by side, but generally speaking, they shouldn't need to be making a lot of changes. Question: are the posing routines scored separately? Answer: no, but they factor heavily into the posing and presentation subscore. Question: but how do they properly calculate the posing and presentation subscore when the posing routines aren't performed until after the comparison round? Answer: this would have to be changed so that the posing routines are done during prejudging, right after all the competitors have gone through the individual compulsories. Question: what about the quarter turns, aka the symmetry round? Answer: these would be included during the individual compulsories and therefore only factor into the individual scores. In my opinion, there is little point in comparing these, as whoever wins the left side relaxed will almost invariably win the right side relaxed as well. Plus, whoever is flexing the hardest in the front and rear semi-relaxed positions will typically have an advantage. I've always just found the idea of semi-relaxed poses a little silly and don't think they should count for much compared to the main mandatory poses. Okay, guys, so that's pretty much it for this one. Hopefully that explanation made some sense and you were able to follow along. So what do you guys think of this new judging system? Do you think it's better or worse than the existing one? And if you have any more questions that weren't already covered, just post them in the comments below and I'll try to respond. Again, I don't expect anything to actually come of this, but the point was to simply show how easy it would be to improve on the current scoring system. I mean, I whipped this whole thing together practically overnight, so it doesn't exactly take a math genius or some kind of bodybuilding wizard, just a bit of basic knowledge and good old-fashioned common sense. And like I said, it's also about presenting solutions, not just constantly voicing criticisms and complaints. Plus, I gotta be honest with you here, I just found this one interesting to do. It was a fun little exercise, so hopefully you guys got something out of it too. And of course, I welcome any other constructive feedback or suggestions as well, so please share them with us. And until next time, this has been the Tominator signing off, and I'll be back!